As human beings, we experience a life which seems to be constantly asking us to change, whether we like it or not. And some of us seem to be able to ride the waves of change better than others. In this video, we will introduce you to a model based on our years of coaching research that illustrates how people respond to the prospect of change and what you can do to manage it more effectively. We call this model the road to change. On the road, we are going to introduce you to a number of different characters who represent people with different attitudes towards change. First up is the holidaymaker, who has the motto, "Happy as I am." This person is perfectly relaxed, chilling out on the plaza of complacency. Even if some minor problem comes along, such as a fly landing in their beer, they are not going to do much about it. After all, it is relatively easy to just fish the fly out or buy another beer. The charms of the status quo on the plaza far outweigh anything else. Getting this person to consider change means getting them to see that there is a problem that needs solving. After all, dissatisfaction is the first factor in Dane Miller's change equation. For example, if the plaza suddenly became inundated in flies, the holidaymaker might start to think it is time to move. Alternatively, you can point them towards the beacon of aspiration in the distance. Life might be great right now, but is there anything that could make it even better? Again, having a vision to aspire to is also a key part of the change equation. Moving on from the plaza of complacency, we enter the swamp of fear. Here the problems have become more serious. The first character we meet here we call the blamer. They can see the problems all right, but their motto is, "It's not my fault." This is the person who tells everybody else how they should change but does nothing themselves. Of course, this is only a defense mechanism. The blamer's main problem is that although they can see the faint light of the beacon of aspiration in the distance, they have built an iron fortress around themselves to protect their fragile egos from harm and avoid moving forward. In attachment theory, we could probably classify them as an avoidant type. In The Road Less Travelled, Scott Peck describes them as a character disorder that abdicates responsibility. The question for the blamer is this: if everyone in the system has a role to play in making change happen, then what can they take responsibility for? The other character we find in the swamp we call the sufferer. They can see the problems too, but this time they take all the blame themselves. So their motto is, "I'm rubbish." In attachment theory, this is more typical of the anxious type. Scott Peck describes them as neurotic because they take on too much responsibility. The sufferer can also see the beacon of aspiration twinkling in the distance, but they are stuck in the mud in victim mode. The danger with being a victim is that you look for a knight in shining armour to come riding in to pull you out. In all likelihood, the knight will end up sinking in the mud too, or fighting with the sufferer in a classic rescue drama triangle. To move on down the road, the sufferer has to call on their own knight inside themselves. A coach can help them build their confidence and focus on the positive rather than the negative through the questions that they ask, which will help the sufferer to find firmer ground and build a more solid foundation for themselves. This is the lifeline they need to help them move forward. One final point about the swamp is that it slows us down for a reason. Time spent here can be time well spent. After all, if you have ever been caught in quicksand, you will know that the best strategy is to stay still. The swamp offers us the opportunity for listening in and reflection. This can help us to gain wisdom and insight that may prevent a car crash further down the road. The next character on the road we call the route finder. They have got themselves out of the swamp and have arrived at the corner of enlightenment. A key transformation has taken place here because the route finder is no longer focused on the negative. The beacon of aspiration is now shining bright and clear, and they can see the benefits to themselves of the change. In the words of Jacob van Wieling, they have made a will decision. Their motto is now, "I want this." This shift is described by George Kohlreis as a switch in the mind's eye, a mindset change from negative to positive, and in attachment theory is indicative of someone who is secure. And it is also supported by Neil Rackham's sales research, which identified that customers will only buy when they have a positive need. Questions for the route finder are now focused on how they want to move forward. This is where the coaching can really start.
Our next character sounds very much like the route finder in that they will talk a good talk about how they need to change. But don't be deceived by the blusterer. Their motto is, I want this, but. In effect, although they can see the positive, they are still stuck in the swamp. This is because for them the fear or risk of change is just too big. It traps them in the same prison that ensnares the blamer. A good approach for the blusterer is to use the immunity to change template developed by Keegan and Lahey. What they refer to as immunity to change, we call the ego defense mode, simply because most blusterers are frequently accused of having an ego by their colleagues. The reality is that everyone has an ego, but in the case of the blusterer and the blamer, their ego is clearly visible in terms of the prison they have built for themselves. The questions in Keegan and Lahey's template ask the blusterer to focus on what they do instead of moving towards change and the fears and assumptions that underlie those actions.
Let's now move on from the route finder rather than backwards and look at the mountain of opportunity. Here we find the driver, and their motto is, I'm taking action. In the change equation, they are taking the first steps towards change, which increases their motivation, and the fear has now subsided. Support from the coach at this point is around helping them to stay focused and on track as they climb towards the beacon of aspiration.
So far, we have painted the road to change as a linear path, but it can sometimes feel like the road to nowhere. As on any road, you will find turn-offs and roundabouts. The route finder may suddenly find themselves on the back road back into the swamp. And for the driver, there is always the possibility of tripping up and plummeting down the slippery slope of failure. This is where resilience kicks in, the ability to get up, kick off the mud, and head back up the road again. But that's the subject of a whole other video.
Before we leave the road to change, we have one other character to introduce. This one has been really hoping that we would pass them by completely unnoticed, but they cannot get off that easily. We call this character the Cave Dweller, and their motto is, I hide. This character has a lot to offer, but they struggle to escape from within the prison they have built for themselves. The cave is such a safe place to be. It is fear of failure more than anything else that holds them back. So they would rather not try at all than risk climbing the mountain of opportunity and ending up on the slippery slope of failure. The questions for them are around what's the fear and what would help them to feel safe. So here are some questions for you. Where do you see yourself on the road to change, and where would you like to be? And if you feel movement is required, how are you going to get there? And if you want to assess your own attachment style, answering the Playing to Win questionnaire on our website will tell you your levels of avoidance and anxiety. If you want help or would like to take part in our research project to assess the attitude towards change within your team, then please get in touch with one of us. And finally, here are some of the writers who have inspired us.